conjecture, and reasoning. Two sides of what I consider the same coin, and oftentimes go hand in hand, contradicting and often clashing with each other. And so I start my video off with this little preface to kind of set the mood for what I believe that this is going to be about, and really to cut to the heart of the matter and to explain in more detail the nuance of my previous video about the wargaming roots of this game. It would be remiss of me if I did not mention an elephant in the room that seems to have popped up. J. Scott Garibay has decided to comment, and I thank him for it, because after all, without interaction, my videos certainly wouldn't have reached the very small circle that it certainly has done in the past 2 years. And of course, I am familiar with J. Scott Garibay. I'm quite familiar with his material and his appearances on other channels, and whether it be debate or discussion, what have you. So this video will not be about me counterpointing Scott Garibay necessarily, although one of his particular points I will be trying to counter-argue. Mark Faulkner, a subscriber to the channel, so excellently did counter-argue Scott, respectfully, I should add, trying to explain what my point was in my previous video when I was talking about wargaming, whereas the modern view, as Mark so excellently puts it, seems to be like running a TV show rather than a game. And he is correct in that assessment. The past couple of videos that I have released in the last 4 to 8 weeks have focused primarily upon subjects such as GM burnout and how I believe we can fix that. And it all comes down to how we view the game. At the end of the day, do I believe that this is in direct contradiction to something more modern like, say, the 5e rule set? Absolutely not. I believe that you could firmly play 5e in the same way that the old grognards of the old guard back in the 70s and 80s played their advanced or basic or expert games. So this is indeed not an edition war. It won't be. I refuse to make it about that, although I've made it no secret that I tend to lean towards the Beck Me side of things, and tend to favor rule sets that emulate such gameplay, such as Basic Fantasy and Labyrinth Lord and other such games. For indeed, I find that if I had to take a rainy day, or better put, desert island book with me, if I was stranded on a desert island and could only have one TTRPG book, my choice would be the Rule Cyclopedia of Dungeons & Dragons from 1991. It contains all I need to run a game, and I could easily come up with alternate rules for anything I didn't like. However, everything that I would personally feel like I need to run a game as straight, as raw as I possibly could would be in that particular volume. But again, this is not about editions. This is not about which rule set is right for you necessarily. This is merely an approach, so to speak, not only to how GMs can run their games, but in how players can roleplay their characters. Now, of course, my approach to any and all things is that when you make a truth claim, you must also back up that truth claim. And the claim that I seek to counterpoint in this video is that Gary was trying to move us away from the wargaming aspect of Dungeons & Dragons. First, let me put out why I am so hardcore about the wargaming aspect. Is because at its roots, Dungeons & Dragons is indeed a wargame. After all, what is original Dungeons & Dragons from 1974 besides supplemental rules for chainmail? After all, this was a game created by a bunch of guys playing war games at conventions or in their basements, often with tanks, often with battleships. It's actually where we get the concept of THAC0 from, or I should more accurately put it, Descending Armor Class. THAC0 came a little bit later, but it was more of a simplified version of Descending Armor Class. After all, the smaller the ship, the lower the armor class, but the less hits it could take. Whereas the bigger the ship, the higher the armor class, but the more hits it could take. So the bigger ship was easier to hit, whereas the smaller ship was harder to hit. Indeed, we need to look no further than the first couple of supplements for the original Dungeons & Dragons game of 1974. The first couple ones we see are, of course, Greyhawk and Blackmoor. Now, we cannot mention Dungeons & Dragons without Dave Arneson. After all, Dave Arneson played as much of a pivotal point as Gary Gygax did. Now, allow me to say that I am fully aware of what Scott Garabay's viewpoint of Dave Arneson is, and his importance to the game, and I do disagree with it as well. However, that is not the point of this video, and so I will not bring it in without him actually saying it himself. But when we talk about Gygax and we talk about Arneson, we see two different viewpoints. Gygax was more the codifier of rules, whereas Arneson could be more accurately described as somebody who put referee fiat in over rules. Rules certainly existed for the verisimilitude of the game and to keep immersion not only believable but fair. And both of these games had both of these settings, I should say, these campaign settings, had their beginnings in wargames. In fact, the term campaign comes from wargame. The fact that anybody uses the term campaign today is because of wargaming. Without wargaming, you would not have that term. And Blackmoor, of course, was born out of really Braunstein more than it was, or Braunstein, however you pronounce it. But it was born about from that game more than it was anything else. And Braunstein was a Napoleonic war game. Now, I don't seek to go much further into detail. The information on Blackmoor and Greyhawk are both out there for anybody to read for free. So, and from secondary sources as well. So, in my opinion, this is something that you need to come up with your own research on to verify my claims on this. Because that's not the scope of this video. The scope of this video is not indeed to prove that Blackmoor and Castle Greyhawk were wargaming campaigns necessarily, but that the game D&D had its roots in wargaming. But Scott has indeed brought forth a claim that is actually true, and the fact that the wargaming aspect is very foreign to today's gaming culture. After all, when's the last time you ever heard of an actual campaign, a real actual campaign of wilderness exploration, going into this other land and retiring characters at a higher level to take on followers? When was the last time you have heard of that? Most people will answer the last time they heard of that would be 2nd edition, but really for the most part from what I've seen is that it was much earlier than that. The last time they've heard of it was somewhere around 1E and the Beckme sets. 2E had a very long lifespan considering the point between its birth and when Wizards of the Coast bought TSR out. But by and large, most things that I see for 2nd edition center more around either higher level play over domain play or lower level play. And so we now reach the truth claim. Was Gygax attempting to get the game away from its wargaming roots? Did he have this vision to see that D&D, which was much bigger than just a war game, and try to take the game away from its roots? This is actually a pretty tall order. And unfortunately for Scott, I don't really deal with conjectures. They are normally put aside because I don't necessarily take them seriously. After all, a truth claim must have some kind of empirical evidence backing it up. Again, I must stress, this is not an attack on Scott, and this is not a call to action to harass him. So if you interact with him, if you interact with Scott, I want to stress that you try to do so in as respectful as a manner as possible. But I'm afraid that, unfortunately for Scott, the evidence seems to contradict his particular worldview or his opinions on this matter. He's more than welcome to hold those opinions and those views, and I shall not attempt to take them away from him, but I must stress why I will not adopt them either. After all, it's hard for me to understand why a man who co-founded, if not solely founded, several wargaming conventions and associations within the Lake Geneva area of Wisconsin, why he would attempt to move his game away from the very thing that it started as. And we really don't need to look much further besides just simply seeing what he worked on after his time with TSR. And this is after the Lorraine Williams situation. So we're not talking about the first time in the early 80s. We're talking about the second time in the mid to late 80s. We know that he worked on some books that I had them wrote down and I've forgotten the name of them. Dangerous Journeys, I believe is what it was called. And the rule set was definitely set up to where higher level play meant domain play. Therefore, running kingdoms, managing realms. Unfortunately, many of these kind of games are hard to come by if they even made it to print at all. For TSR, of course, Lorraine Williams promptly sued Gygax immediately after hearing that he was putting this material out. And, of course, even though the courts did not find any kind of reason for litigation, Lorraine Williams and TSR decided to go ahead with the lawsuits anyway. And one man versus a big company, well, a company bigger than him at least. Not a very fair fight, and one that we see reflected in today's culture as well, not just within the gaming community, but within everything from healthcare to car insurance. Anyways, one of the few things we do have, though, is that after the acquisition of Dungeons & Dragons by Wizards of the Coast, Gary would not really work much with Dungeons & Dragons in the newer incarnation in 3rd edition. Gary would write a preface to some adventure books, and his time would be finished really working with that company. Instead, he worked with releasing Castle Greyhawk under a different name. I believe it was Castle Zagig, something like that. It was Greyhawk, but released for Castles and Crusades. Because Castle Greyhawk, because all the IPs had been purchased by Wizards of the Coast, he would need to change the name. And so we see with Castle Zagig, if I'm saying that name correctly, is domain play after dungeon crawling. The stress is more on dungeon crawling than it is anything else, which is another aspect of the game in today's culture I feel like it's missing. But that is a subject for another time. And so we turn our attention towards the wargaming aspect, in which it does appear that wargaming, in terms of domain and realm play, seem to be what is called the end game, quote unquote, of a character's existence within that setting as well. So, as anticlimactic as this ending seemed to be, I must stress that while Scott is certainly allowed to hold to his viewpoints and opinions, I'm under no obligation to necessarily adopt those. He can hold those views all he wants, and I'm welcome to mine as well. And so, as I get ready to sign off, I want to reiterate my point of this was not meant to be harassment or a call to harass. But I tend to agree with Haster in my comments, who I know who Haster is in real life. And I will, of course, not dox him by revealing his real name. But I do agree with Haster in that the way that, let me explain how mine and Haster's history, and you will understand why. Haster and I met each other through different series of Reformed Christian Facebook groups. And so the common debate is always around the text of Scripture in these particular groups, such as confessional bibliology and whatnot. And so when somebody posts in these groups, the truth claim must be backed up with where it is written in the Word of God. Yea, hath God said, after all. And that is the attitude that Haster and I both bring to the table when we talk about such things. I understand that most, or at least many of my viewers are a-religious, if not atheistic. And that's totally understandable. The reason I bring this up is because this kind of thinking, this is why Haster said, show me where Gary wrote this. Because that's how we are when it comes to debating, say, Unitarians or Mormons in these groups, right? Point to Scripture where God has said. And so, while I will certainly not put Gary up on such a pedestal as to equate him with the Almighty, Gary and other men that helped build the game, whether we're talking about Dave Arneson or Eric Holmes or Tom Moldvay or David Cook, their writings on the rules definitely do matter in the intent to which they intended the game to end or to continue. So that's why you see Companion and Masters and Immortals, because higher level play, bring that option. In fact, the existence of Expert is higher level play, as took you up to level 14, and most characters before then were retired by level 10 or 12. And the reason that I adopt this view that Dungeons & Dragons should indeed return to its wargaming roots is because you will find that the game is much more easier not only to run but even create for. Let's say you want to create the most railroady story possible. You can certainly do that with a wargaming mentality and do so in a way that's believable. After all, going from town A to town B with almost nothing happening in between, except for maybe one random encounter, even though you traveled 10, 12 miles, that breaks immersion. Whereas if you're rolling hex by hex, let's say you're going 10 to 12 miles, rolling for each and every mile for every hour, give or take, whatever the speed is on your characters, but we'll say for simplicity's sake, 1 mile an hour. Rolling for every 1 mile an hour brings an immersion of this world is alive and has things in it, and that these things can ambush you or they can help you. After all, not every encounter in the older rule sets that Gary actually wrote, these encounters didn't always have to be combat encounters. The existence of reaction rolls, which is something that I've talked about in the past on my channel, the existence of reaction rolls keeps the game exciting because it keeps things from being a static combat encounter for every encounter. And I believe that current modern editions can be fixed by simply looking to what these older writers wrote, to what rule sets these older writers published. They are popular for a reason. Now, there is a reason why, for example, B2 was the most best-selling module of all time. Number one, because it came with almost every set of basic. But number two, it's also because it was dirt cheap and it was a sandbox. And it had everything you needed to start a game. And in fact, you can find plenty of videos of men and women who bought basic and they just picked up copies of B2 and they don't even remember where they came from. They'd pick them up at a yard sale. They'd pick them up at a flea market. They'd pick them up at a hobby shop. They'd buy another basic box set just to give to somebody else, and there'd be a copy of it in there, But, while the sales of B2 might have been a little bit inflated by the fact of the box set, people also legitimately bought the book by itself, and it's one of the most widely used modules of all time. But I'm dragging on, and I should cut this now. And I've kept you too long. Thank you for everyone that has interacted with the discussions tonight. As always, take care, God bless, and I'll see you on the other side.